Welcome to the Tech Ed Podcast, where we visit with leaders who are shaping, innovating, and disrupting technical education. People who are not afraid to think differently, not afraid to try something new, all with the goal of securing the American dream for the next generation of STEM and workforce talent. Welcome back to the Tech Ed Podcast. I am Matt Kirkner, and we have an opportunity every single week to talk to people who are innovating and disrupting the world of technical education. You know, as a former manufacturing employer, one of the things that I had an opportunity to do was to expand businesses in new regions and in new areas. And back then, what we would be concerned about is what were the incentives that a local region would provide to us. We were interested in proximity to customers, proximity to our suppliers. All of those things are still important. But if you talk to manufacturing employers and any type of employer these days, what they will tell you is at the very top of the list is access to qualified workers and to a world-class workforce. And so because of that, they are also waking up to the incredible value that our nation's technical and community colleges offer, not just to employers, but to the entire economic development of an entire region. That is what we are talking about today on this episode of the Tech Ed Podcast. My guest is Jan Moore, Vice President for Economic Development, Ogeechee Technical College. Welcome to the Tech Ed Podcast.
Thank you, Matt. Just ecstatic, excited to be here.
Ecstatic is the perfect word. I love that word, and we feel the same way. We're going to learn so much about the work you're doing, Jan, and that your team is doing in the world of economic development, in the world of workforce development, partnering with some world-class employers. So let's get started. I guess the first question I would have, I'm always fascinated by people's career paths. How did they get from point A to point B? Where did they start out, and where are they now? So tell us a little bit about how you found your role as Vice President for Economic Development and the path that led you there.
I can promise you this is kind of strange. So
the stranger, the better.
Here we go. When I got out of graduate school, I went to work as a systems analyst. And this was in the mid 80s. And At the time, I said, I don't want to sit behind a computer for all day long, every day. You know, not the brightest thought. Went into the private sector in sales, became vice president of marketing and sales for a large company, started another company, sold off the assets, had 2 small children. And my husband, obviously, he worked as well at the time. And I decided I didn't want to fly around the world anymore, fly around the country. So I went back to graduate school, became a psychologist, worked with children, got hired in higher ed as dean of students, and just went further to become vice president for economic development. I was tapped for that position because I had so much experience in the private sector. It's unusual for people in higher ed. That's atypical.
Well, what a fascinating pathway. And you're right, that is a little bit strange in a really, really good way, a fascinating way to find your way into the role that you have now, that being VP for Economic Development. So tell us a little bit about that role and what keeps you busy in that position and some of the initiatives you're working on, Jan.
Well, you know, it's really interesting. I had this conversation the other day with a couple of people. Economic development is such a broad term. It means so many different things to so many people, depending on your industry, whether you're private, public, you're a development authority, you're working at a university level, a technical college level. So, what I do is unique to the technical college system. I'll just say that from an economic development standpoint. We're there to support industry, business in our area by training the workforce that feeds them. That might be different. If you're an economic developer, you're trying to lure industry into the area. So we all have that title, but we serve very, very different functions.
Yeah, for sure. And I love the way that you're taking this all-encompassing view toward the work that you're doing. So tell us a little bit, Jan, about your specific region. You know, where is the technical college? What's unique about that region? What are some of the workforce needs? What are the industries that you're serving in your role?
We're actually probably located in one of the most robust regions in the country at this time.
Wow.
It's in Southeast Georgia. And for those that are listening that have no idea from a standpoint of what cities are located, everybody knows Atlanta, largest airport in the world.
Right.
Busiest airport in the world in Atlanta. So we're about 3 hours, about 180 miles southeast of Atlanta.
Okay.
And about 45 miles west of Savannah.
Okay.
So close to the coast on that main corridor that's running Atlanta to Savannah, that runs through Macon, Georgia, and comes towards Statesboro. So that's the region where we're located. I'll tell you just a real quick thing on the dynamics of that region. It contains the largest, the Port of Georgia is located in Savannah. It's either, I think right now it's the second largest container port in the country.
Wow.
You get a sense of the region there in addition to the other things that are happening that you referenced.
So absolutely. Yeah. When we think about large container ports, I think everybody thinks about, areas in California and so on. And obviously you've got the second largest container port, which really is probably both a function driving economic development and a result of economic development, but so many other great things happening in your state, including a huge investment on the part of Hyundai, I understand. So tell us a little bit about this investment that Hyundai is making in your region. What are they building there? How does this the size of this investment compare to maybe other manufacturers across the U.S. and so on? Give us a sense for that, because I know that's driving a lot of the work that you do.
The one word I would use is massive. It's truly massive in a number of ways. Our Governor, Brian Kemp, has made it an effort over the last few years for Georgia to become the electric vehicle manufacturing destination in the country, and he has virtually created that. This Hyundai piece, which is about 28 miles from our campus, is a big part of that. Hyundai itself is making a $5.5 billion investment.
Billion with a B.
Wow. 3,000 acres. They just announced a battery plant that they're partnering with, which is another 4.3 billion. That's just two. And then when you take the ancillary suppliers, et cetera, that are coming in with that, you've got another several billion. So haven't seen the final number, their announcements every day. So let's just say, for argument's sake, in this area, within a 24-month period, you've got a $20 billion investment.
Wow, that's absolutely huge. Go on.
From an employee standpoint, the estimate is between 14 and 16,000 employees outside. I mean, just above and beyond what the workforce is in this area will be needed for the workforce for those new plants, et cetera.
Yeah, that's incredible. And you think about the workforce for the plants themselves, and then all the ancillary opportunities that are created, because those of us that work in and around economic development know that for every one job in manufacturing, there's somewhere between 2 and 5 additional jobs that can be created in an economy. So I think the word that you use, massive, is an apropos and appropriate one, because that is exactly what's going on in your region. You touched on those employees in the growth there. Specifically on the workforce front, Jan, tell us about what types of employees are going to be in demand, and what types of skills you're going to need to train these folks up for.
It's really interesting, because that is a two-phase thing. When you look at strictly what is demanded by the new manufacturers coming in that are Hyundai related, et cetera, you're talking about folks that have to be familiar with EVs, but on top of that, things like PLCs and switching and the robotics, just the robotics automation, all these plants is substantial. And that is not the correct word, because it's not big enough.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then you've got a backfill situation that we have, which is hugely problematic, because when you're the shiny new toy down the street, everybody wants to go to work for you.
Right.
And they have to have these employees. So they're going to price appropriately to lure people in. That's not a bad thing. It's just a business thing. So what ends up happening is all these folks that have been here are losing experienced employees to this new development. And because of that, they have to be trained up to where they were, maybe not on the newest technology that's coming in, but just to meet the need there. So we're seeing it in two different ways.
As somebody that's been involved in a number of these projects, several years ago, I remember when a huge investment was being made in Southeast Wisconsin, and I sat down with the president of one of the regional technical colleges, and the way we characterized it was this: it's like, this is the biggest investment, perhaps the biggest thing that has happened in our region in the last 50 years. It is a huge opportunity, and the only thing that could prevent it from working is the lack of a skilled workforce. And I looked him in the eye and said, and your responsibility is to create that skilled workforce. That's a lot of pressure. I've got to believe that the college feels a lot of pressure around creating that next generation of technologists and of manufacturing talent. Are you feeling a little bit of that at the moment?
I would say that is 100% accurate. You did not miss the mark on that whatsoever. We do. But to be honest with you, Matt, when you sit in a position like mine, it's kind of like I don't know if you like golf or not. You know, if you've ever played golf or grown up playing golf or competitive playing golf, any of those things, you always stand on the putting green ahead of time and you're practicing and you're with a buddy and you're like, okay, this putt is to win the Masters or this putt is to win this. It's clearly not, but there's some immediate exhilaration that goes with that. Even though you dream of that all day. Well, when you sit in my chair, I dream of this or have since I've had this position. You know, it's that same analogy. It's that this time is for real. It's like, what would you do if you had all of this? This is for all the marbles. And this is, you know, the job that we're doing in tandem with our quick start partners who partner with all new industry that are coming in tandem with all the development authorities. You don't get to sit in this chair, be in this position, address this issue, grow, provide what you need to provide at this demand level, maybe once in your career.
Absolutely.
This is that one. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you I love to compete. So it's like, bring it. Let's go. Let's make this work.
I love that. I absolutely love that attitude. Sounds like we've got the right leader in the right chair at the right time, because that is exactly the attitude that we need to have. You know, certainly not just at Ogeechee Tech, but across the United States, as we think about the incredible value that workforce development and an advanced workforce has in terms of attracting and retaining employers. And you make a great point, Jan. It's not just about how do we upskill that next level of employee for a huge investment like the one that Hyundai is making, but then where do we go from there as far as backfilling positions for people that are moving? And expansion creates expansion. And we've seen that all over, that once you create that tidal wave, more and more employers want to come. Certainly you'll have tons of tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers that are going to want to be a part of this expansion as well. Then how do we backfill all those roles around all kinds of new technologies? And a few of which you've mentioned. You talked about automation, you talked about PLCs. Can you go into a little more depth about the types of skills that these employers are looking for?
We hear it's really interesting. I think that employers on some level have come to accept they themselves are going to have to skill up the people that they hire. That we just don't have enough skilled labor. And when I say skilled labor, I'm thinking the things that we train in are, we train a lot in industrial maintenance. And for those listening that don't know what industrial maintenance is, it is the skills that you need to keep automation running in facilities. You know, you have to understand electric, you have to understand mechanical, you have to understand motor controls to do electricity, pneumatics, hydraulics, PLCs, we've referenced that as becoming more and more huge. The robotics are embedded into these automation practices and automation, you know, how they're set up throughout these manufacturing facilities. You have to know the basics of all of that. And that seems to be the key. Now, what we're seeing is the automation side of it, the predictive analytics, the predictive maintenance, understanding when you do something before it breaks. That is becoming huge. If you can't read that data, if you don't understand that, then you don't know what to go out and fix before it needs fixing. So we are seeing all sorts of, even AI embeds into that. How do you read it? What do you do? That type of thing. So it's evolving for us every day as well.
I love the way that you approach that, and really the level of detail that you have, you know, for an individual in your position who's managing all kinds of different projects and all kinds of different details, to be able to go that in depth in terms of whether it's electrical systems, mechanical drives, fluid power, like pneumatics and hydraulics. And when we talk about upskilling that next generation toward careers in whatever we want to call it, Industry 4.0, IIoT, Infinity 0.0, certainly automation plays a huge part of that. And we kind of talk about that layering, and we talk about you need to understand all those base technologies. It doesn't do us any good to be able to run a really high-end analytic and on a machine learning platform that's measuring data that we don't even understand the equipment that data is coming from. So I love the way that you characterize that entire continuum. We say from edge to cloud and everything in between. And I agree 100%. That is the type of worker that manufacturers are looking at and looking for. I think you also mentioned something that we don't often hear from educators and people working in the education space, which is the responsibility that the employer also has to upskill the next generation of the workforce. So a big part of the puzzle is how do we inspire young people who are maybe in middle school, high school, going through a technical or community college program toward these careers in advanced manufacturing and industry. That's really, really important. But we also have a responsibility once they're employed there to upskill the next generation of the workforce. It's not a 2 years and you're done. So talk a little bit about how you encourage employers to continue that lifelong learning approach and to partner in the learning and not just put that responsibility on education?
That's a really interesting question because I have seen that dynamic change dramatically in the last 36 to 48 months. The unemployment rate is super low everywhere, but I mean, it is 2% here.
Wow.
It is as low gets. And so employers are realizing that they've got to keep these folks. So we always say, train, retain to maintain.
Yep.
We're not going to keep them. And so that used to not be something they bought into.
Right.
And now they are. And they're having to understand if you don't invest in your employees, they're going to go somewhere where they will.
Absolutely.
And that dynamic is changing. It's not 100% there. And part of the problem, quite frankly, is they are running typically really tightly staffed. So taking people off what they're doing to go to training is painful for them, but it's a pain that they're now willing to accept that in the past was not so much.
I've got a good friend in the form of Paul Perkins, who's the president of a company called Amatrol. And Paul told me several years ago, he said, if you think about people working in manufacturing today, and then you turn the clock forward, 20 years, a good portion of your workforce in advanced manufacturing 20 years from now are people that are already working in advanced manufacturing today. And so in as much as it's important for us to inspire that next generation toward these careers and give them the skills that are necessary to be successful when they get there, equally, if not more important, is how do we take the people that are already in manufacturing and upskill them around technologies that you've already mentioned that are changing at just an incredible rate. And so, I love that spirit of partnership. And it sounds like you're starting to find that resonates with your employers in a way that maybe it didn't 5 or 10 years ago.
Oh, that's completely accurate. And we're finding it in a couple of ways. They're realizing that we started this journey that we've been on with creating the training platforms that we have several years ago. And the employers who bought into it and have run people through what we do, and we have various levels of training that we do, some that are intense, some that are long, some that are short, the gambit, they're realizing they're retaining these people.
Mm-hmm.
And that is big key. And so once they realize that training retains them, all of a sudden it has, exploded with other manufacturers that are trying to do the same thing. The flip side of that is apprenticeships are becoming huge.
Yep.
Huge. And they're really willing to invest in that. They know when they do, they've got an employee, quite frankly, for 2 years, because that on-the-job training is 2,000 to 4,000 hours. It can be longer than that.
Right.
Those employees want that DOL certificate that they have finished an official apprenticeship. And that's becoming, I think that's going to be honestly the biggest game changer that's going to happen over the next 10 years. You're going to see that become very, very pervasive.
Yep, we agree 100%. And you think about the incredible value that happens both for the apprentice and for the employer. The apprentice is getting a tremendous amount of learning. They're getting paid while they're going through that process. Really, really important. They're experiencing that company's culture. And I think when we think about retention of employees and creating the kind of culture, meaning, what is our mission? What are our core values? Are we living those out? Are we actually using those to make decisions in the business? Or are they just words we hang on the wall to feel good about ourselves? And building that right culture, getting to know each other, the apprentice and the employer, and then building that really, really strong relationship that's based on adding value for the employer, creating the right experience for the employee, and then lifelong learning and training, which I think is where you began that last answer, which is when we train employees, when we invest in them, you'd think it'd be common sense, right? That they're more likely to stick around, that they're going to be individuals who recognize that the company values them, is giving them more skills. When we give them more skills, they add more value. When they add more value, we can pay them more money. The jobs probably become more interesting. They get closer and closer to technology. There's more job security. All these things that happen when we upskill our existing workforce. And I love the approach that you're taking toward working and partnering with employers around that importance of lifelong learning. Let's turn the clock back just a little bit, Jan, if we can. And I'd be interested in traditionally, what does the learning look like at Ogeechee Tech? And then going forward, we love education disruptors. So my next question is going to be around what are you doing to disrupt that model and how do you see education changing? But let's start with what's the traditional model been?
The traditional model is to get a certificate, degree, or diploma. in a certain occupational area, and we have several. We're talking today specifically, about the automation side of the house. And you can get a traditional commercial electrician, industrial systems degree on the academic side of the house. Most of that stuff can take 1 semester, 2, up to 4 to 6. It just depends on what you're doing. And I'm going to kind of piggyback a little bit back on apprenticeships for our college. That's a little bit different. When you hear about an apprenticeship, most people, I think that's the reason in the United States, it did not take off until now. It was academic based. You came over to get an academic diploma or degree, and while you were in academic school, going to 2 or 3 classes a week, you were working for an employer, and you were trying to do that over the period of time that you were getting your degree or diploma. We disrupted that. We said, no, we're going to do apprenticeships where we take people that are already working for employers, bringing over to the non-credit side where we do non-credit training. You're not doing it for a certificate, degree, or diploma. And we're going to train you. We're the related technical instruction. So you come however many days a week off out of the plant, out of the facility, you get your training, you go back to work and employ that training, and you are an employee of the company and they're paying for you to do this. That has just grown exponentially. Because that model makes sense to our manufacturers.
Sure it does.
They can work it in with a schedule. We were the first college to do non-credit apprenticeships for the technical college system of Georgia. That just hadn't been done, but they worked with us on being able to do that. And it's been a turnaround. I would suggest for any technical college across the country to look at that model and work with their employers on that because it works.
Absolutely. When my friend Travis Kuhn put us together, Travis Kuhn, of course, the president of Technical Training Aids, put us together. He said you were a disruptor. He said that we were going to enjoy the conversation. And I can tell you that that's exactly the experience that we're having here on the Tech Ed podcast. So thanks to Travis for connecting us. But, as you talk about the apprenticeship model and you've touched on the value to the employer, what kind of feedback, Jan, are you getting from the apprentices themselves about that journey and their experience?
We've had nothing but positive feedback from employees. They feel valued. And that's the most important thing because it's an investment. It's about 11 to 12 month investment, a day a week to come to us for the RTI and then go back to their facilities. So they feel like they're being invested in. They appreciate it. They are definitely coming out with a much higher level of skill than they came in. They have guaranteed income increases across the divide of that training, and then they get a bump at the end. So it's very positive for them. The employees are thoroughly excited. They've got a more highly skilled employee who's happy.
Absolutely. One of the blessings, I think, of the really, really tight labor market is it has forced employers to think really deeply about how they create that employee experience and how they incentivize their employees, how they recruit their employees, and how they retain their employees in a really, really good way. And going back to that whole idea of culture and what experiences that the employees are having as they're enjoying their opportunities in the workforce. And you work with so many different employers. What are some of the innovative things you're seeing on that side in terms of recruitment and retention, in terms of keeping employees engaged and creating a future and really that long-term partnership as opposed to just hey, this is a place you can come work and earn a paycheck?
One of the employers that we train for, I'm not going to mention their name, but they're massive. They're huge. And they send us 30 to 40 their employees for 12 weeks at a time. And they go through an apprenticeship program, and they come from all over the country. They stay in Statesboro, Georgia, where we're located. We train them. They come out with 8 SACA certifications when they leave, and they become a maintenance tech 1 for them. This is what's really innovative. The day those people step off our campus, and they're all apprentices. So the day they step off our campus, having completed that 12-week training successfully, they get a 40% raise.
Wow. On
that day. And so that employer is saying, we're going to take you, train you from being a $20 an hour employee to now being a $28 an hour employee. And then there's another bump a year or 2 down the road when they complete. So think about that. What in a 24-month period, what that's done for that employee. I'm going to tell you what, that's a loyal bunch of people. They come to see us every single time. We'll run a couple of hundred through this year.
Yeah.
I don't know what our numbers are going to look like next year, but from an innovation standpoint, not everybody can do that, but I think that's the kind of thing you're going to begin to see.
Absolutely. I'm getting a little bit of goosebumps as our listeners know. I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but and so our listeners know, I did not put you up to that last answer. I actually serve on the national board of SACA, the Smart Automation Certification Alliance, and have now for some 5 years probably. And what you just said, Jan, is exactly the way that credentials are supposed to work. The story that you just told shows exactly the value of credentialing. And that is, if we can focus a student or learner on specific skills that are valued by an employer, and then show them a path to another 40% compensation. Who among us, regardless of what our comp level is, wouldn't find a way to another 40% if that was available to us? That really shows the magic of third-party certifications. And it sounds like you're making those a significant part of your programs. Talk to us a little bit more, not just about SACA, but about the value of third-party certs and how you're putting them to work.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting, and maybe you can speak to this coming from your background, Matt, but we didn't see that employers necessarily cared about those third-party certifications. They felt like years ago, I'm not talking about in today's world, I'm talking about 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, that if that employee got those certifications, it made them more marketable. I'm sure that people listening to this, if somebody's on the other side of the manufacturing side's like, well, yeah, that's a dirty little secret. Well, it's no secret. We all knew it.
Right.
But they've come to realize that those certifications are important because now you understand what's walking into your door to apply. Now you understand exactly what that individual can do, not what they put on the resume that they actually cannot do when they get on your floor. So it's becoming more and more important. And they also realize the value to the employee, that you value them. You put them in a position to earn those certifications. Those certifications then come into play when it comes to an increase in pay. This becomes less subjective and more objective and merit-based. It checks so many boxes for both the employee and the employer that everybody's kind of come to the party on it.
Awesome. I have a really good friend. I love the story. We were sitting down, and this goes back to that same time range you were talking about 5, 7 years ago, Jan. And I said to this individual, have you thought about, third-party certifications and the value that they might have in training your team and upskilling them toward these certifications? And he said, yeah, we thought about that. But, the worry has always been that, we train them up and give them all those skills in that certification, and then somebody recruits them away. And my answer is, you're probably right about that. You'd be way better off just keeping all your people stupid forever, and then they'll never go anywhere. Is that a better model? And he sat there for a minute, and he's all in on employee training now. Or I think I saw a comic a couple of years ago where it was somebody like HR coming into the CEO and saying, hey, we should do this big training program. And the CEO says, well, what happens if we train everybody and they leave? And the answer was, well, what happens if we don't train them and they stay? And I think it was finally coming around to the importance of employee upskilling of those third-party certifications. And I think employers are starting to understand the value of the right ones specific to the SACA credentials that you referenced. You look at the list of employers that have been a part of establishing the standards that are being used for those certifications. And it's an impressive list, and that's how you get the engagement. That's how you get the value. You talked about apprenticeships, you've talked about third-party credentials and micro-credentials. Any other things on your top list of 3 or 4 disruptions that you think really need to happen in higher education, particularly technical education, Jan, that our listeners should be aware of?
I'm so glad you asked me that. I have one that I preach, in the South, that's what we do. We preach timing. It takes too long for people to get the skills that they need. And we have got to figure out, as a technical college system, how do we shorten? How do we go speed to degrees, speed to skills? It can be done. It's just the traditional model that we have does not lend itself to that.
Right.
And so that's what we've got to figure. I think the reason that the non-credit side of what we do has exploded in growth is because it is quicker.
Yep.
I'm not going to tell you that they learn any more coming through a non-credit than they would through the credit side, but they're going to do it much quicker. And so that's what we've got to figure out. We know that we need to credential people. We know that we need to find training models that work within their existing jobs. What we need to do now is figure out how can we deliver that skills training in a much more compacted fashion, because that's what people want. And frankly, that's what they need.
Absolutely. That whole timing issue, we had the superintendent of St. Paul Public School District in Minnesota on with us. I'm going to guess it was a year and a half, 2 years ago, perhaps. who said something that to me just like it was one of those moments in time where it's like, oh my goodness, I hadn't thought about that, but you are so, so right. He said, if you think about how we educate the typical student, that model hasn't really changed much in 50 years. He said, you look at, when we got done with World War II, we created that next generation of education. It's a teacher who's lecturing to a classroom of 30 students and writing on a chalkboard or a whiteboard or what have you. And he said, we really haven't disrupted that model in more than half a century at a time when every other aspect of our lives, from technology to transportation to everything, has been totally disrupted and changed. And we focus so much on time in a seat, time in a classroom, class periods, number of courses, number of classes, number of credits. And when you think about it, we get into the workforce and none of that really matters. What matters is what you're capable of doing and where you can add value. And if we can educate based upon competencies, and maybe somebody needs a little more time to gain a competency, maybe somebody needs a little bit less time and can move more quickly through the content. Neither one of those are good or bad. That's just fine. We got to meet our learners where we are. And it sounds like that's a huge focus in terms of what you're talking about in this next generation of how we educate the learners and the workers that follow the generation that came before them. Am I getting that right?
No, that's 100% correct. If we don't look at that, if we don't look and say, we should be thinking about today what education looks like in 5 years. If you're not thinking about that today, you're way, way behind. I mean, you've got to, the model has absolutely 100% got to change. Does that mean that technical colleges shouldn't continue to deliver the instruction that they do? No, it doesn't mean that. It just means how it gets delivered, when it gets delivered, and the time frame it gets delivered. At how do we turn it so that, or make it so that the people that are taking it in can take it in. The scheduling is all of these things. But you're right. It's almost a travesty that we haven't disrupted education. And it's coming. You look at enrollment in higher ed is down. You look at enrollment in higher ed at all. There are technical college systems where enrollment is down. There is zero reason for that. There is no reason for that, other than the fact we have not adapted to the society that we live in. We are not addressing those needs, and I'll be the first to say it. We can and we will, but we have to. It's that straightforward.
I agree with you on all three of those points. We can and we will and we have to. And if you think about, higher education in general, that demographics are not in favor of the traditional higher education model in terms of enrollment. And if we can't find new and more effective and more interesting and more appealing ways to usher this next generation of students into higher education, there's going to be fewer and fewer reasons for them to find their way there. And so I think we absolutely have to disrupt it. You turn the clock forward 5 years, Jan, and so I'll take the bait. And you said, we have to change education over the course of the next 5 years. I'm sure some of that includes third-party credentials, apprenticeships, timing that we've already talked about. Anything else, if we turn the clock forward 5-10 years on Jan Moore's radar, that you're like, this is what education needs to look like, and this is what we need to evolve to?
I've got to think the delivery model has to change in some way. Mm-hmm. I'm not exactly sure what that is. Right. If I had the answer, and if I actually did know what it was, I'm not going to tell anybody else. I'm just going to package it and sell it, and that will be that. But I don't.
I'm the first buyer when you have that product. Let me know.
Exactly right. I think our delivery model. We've become so comfortable with online learning, but how successful is it really?
Right.
So we're going to have to become and be really honest with our delivery models and see what is that sweet spot. And I don't have that answer today for you. That's something that will evolve, but I do think it's delivery. I think it's 100% where it goes. And then some of it is, do we need to be very honest about all the information that we're providing? How much is truly necessary?
Sure. Yeah.
It's always been that model, like you say, but how much of it is truly necessary to the end of what that individual needs to learn and to know? And I think one of the keys is that I'm so excited about it. And you will think this is ironic, but I know everybody talks about the new term is the paper ceiling.
Right.
Degrees, diplomas, all these things, you have that. And if you don't have any of these things, you can't get through the paper ceiling. That keeps you down. And now all of a sudden they're looking at skills and credentialing and all those things. Not to knock degrees and diplomas. They have value. Value melded in with everything else that we are doing. It's just a question of what does that look like? What does that labyrinth look like for every individual that comes through? And that's what we have to figure out how to deliver. And I don't know that at this point has yet, to me, it's not been done.
For sure. Yeah. And I think we're at a really exciting apex, I think, especially for technical education, when you think about all of the different ways that we can deliver learning. And then what I love to dream about, frankly, is you start thinking about using artificial intelligence and machine learning to create a specific learning pathway for every individual learner based upon the way that they learn and gain competency. So if we can in real time understand how somebody is learning, how they are whether it's memorization or whether it's learning a task, learning to perform a skill, what is the best way for that individual to learn, gather that data, and then deliver the learning to them on an individualized basis in a fashion that makes it most efficient, which, by the way, starts to check your boxes on things like timing and advancing the speed to the competency that, as we both agree, are what are important when we get to the workforce. And that competency can be things like systems thinking or problem solving or troubleshooting, so they can still be abstract concepts in certain ways, but in a way that delivers that learning to every single specific learner. It's going to be an exciting 5 to 10 years in higher education. And I love disruption. I love change. And it's just we have such a beautiful vantage point right now toward the total disruption of education at every level that I think is going to just put us in a much better place in the future. So lots and lots of optimism. Speaking of optimism, speaking of growth, I know you've got some major expansion projects in the works as far as how you're responding to this incredible growth in your region, Jan. So talk about Ogeechee Tech and talk about some of the advancements that you're making in terms of expanding your ability to reach your learners and reach your economic partners.
I'm really glad you asked me that question. I get to talk about our new building that just was funded, the Georgia Industrial Systems and Industrial Robotics Training Center.
All right.
It'll be unique to the state of Georgia. It'll be about 37,000 square feet, I think, is our initial estimate of the building itself. It will focus on higher level industrial systems training, like you say, from edge to cloud.
Mm-hmm.
Like that. Got to remember that.
Sure.
And we will begin to, expand what we're doing on the robotics side. Right now, as a college, we're a certified trainer for FANUC.
Sure.
But this will allow us to expand that footprint in the robotics area, in the area of robotics, and we will be unique. And what we're going to do, what part of the vision is to train instructors on how to train. So that will be part of what happens in this facility, in addition to just training local people regionally and nationally, actually, in all of those areas. So we're super excited about that. Again, don't throw me, give it to me. Let's go. How exciting is that? You just don't get these opportunities. It's a once in a lifetime thing. And so for a college, we're unique in the sense that we're the smallest technical college in the system. And yet we're exploding in these areas. And we set this footprint. Our president, Lori Durden, was courageous enough to say, okay, let's do it. Let's take our resources and put it in that area.
Wow.
She didn't have to do that.
With all that's going on.
She did, because she was the former vice president of economic development. I took her position when she became president. So she saw the value in everything that we are doing. So I'll be remiss in not giving her a shout out, because if your president says we're not doing that, then guess what? You're not doing that.
Okay. It's so exciting, and all those technologies that'll be available there for your students, and both. I'm assuming that's for both the traditional credit students and for your workforce training as well. Is that fair to say?
It'll be predominantly non-credit, but having said that, obviously our credit students will be in there as well. And one of the things that makes me excited is, and I don't know how you feel about this, but we have such incredible automation that's going on in the plants that are currently that we have, but also the ones that are being under construction will be operating. People don't get to see that. The average person has no clue about what's going on around them in these facilities. And so how do you engage? How do you engage, people in your local economies to get excited about a career in that, other than to hear, gosh, I went to work down here and I made X. They're going to see in real time what is going on around them through our facility. And to me, that's very exciting. We become a steward of this technology within our region and bringing people to understand it, embrace it, and want to work with it. And so we don't take that very lightly at all. That's a priority for what we do.
And nor should you take that lightly. As you're telling that story, Jan, it hits on so many different levels, because part of it is inspiring young people toward these types of careers and letting them see this technology. And you're right, most of them aren't walking down the assembly line at Hyundai to understand how automated and how technical these jobs can be and how advanced manufacturing can be in this day and age. So you're reaching students with that, you're reaching their parents. One of the other things that I think is really important is you're reaching a lot of the employers. You mentioned the the disruption that'll take place as employees are going to the shiny new object in the form of this new manufacturing operation that's coming into your region. A lot of the legacy employers are the ones that have been around. Maybe that's the wrong poor choice of words, but the ones that have been in the region a long time, they too need to be inspired toward the value of automation, toward smart technology, toward the new world of advanced manufacturing. And so that opportunity for them to see it is so important as well, and for their incumbent workforce to see it. So you're right, in as much as the focus needs to be on generating competencies and training the next generation of the workforce, we can also use centers like this one to inspire manufacturers and potential employees in manufacturing around these exciting new careers. And it sounds like that's exactly the way that you're looking at this.
I think that's correct. And also, we have seen quite an uptick in the number of what you would call legacy employers, ones that have been in our region for 30, 40 years, since the late 80s, early 90s is a better way to put it. All of a sudden, they're coming to us saying, now, what robotics can you train on? Because that's the ones we want to order.
Yeah, isn't that right?
And so that is, we had not seen that until probably in the last 24 to 36 months. And clearly that's in response to difficulty hiring people. If they don't input more automation, they're not going to be able to run those facilities. Just a sheer fact. So
absolutely,
we're seeing a lot of that, and they're like, we just need somebody that can train them. So you tell us what robots can you train on, and those are ones we're going to buy.
Right.
So, and that's been a big change for us.
And that's a huge message.
Manic is listening to this. I need a.
Absolutely. Well, I'm sure they are, and they're the focus. We always come back to let's collectively secure the American dream for the next generation of STEM and workforce talent. That's the goal, right? But that if you're an employer that is, or an OEM rather, that is manufacturing automation equipment, really shows the incredible value of partnering with education, because we see it. I see it in industry too, and it doesn't matter whether it's a robot, it's a CNC machine, it's a programmable logic controller, whatever. The technology that a student is learning in the classroom is the technology that you're going to see the employers invest in, because that's where the talent pool is. That's where the opportunity is. So appreciate you mentioning FANUC. Obviously, we've got a great partnership with them here at the Tech Ed Podcast. But for any industrial employer that's manufacturing technology that's being put to work in the automation space, the critical importance of partnering with education in a fashion that makes the solutions affordable, that makes cutting edge technology available in the classroom and in the lab. That is really, really important. We're having a phenomenal conversation today with Jan Moore. Jan is the Vice President for Economic Development at Ogeechee Technical College. And Jan, we've got time for just one more question. It's been an awesome conversation. It's amazing how quickly the time can go when you get into really fascinating discussions. But that question for you here on the Tech Ed Podcast is, I want to take you all the way back to being a 15-year-old young woman and growing up in the world that you did, and thinking about the future that you have in front of yourself and all of the opportunities. And if you had one thing that you could go back and tell that young individual, that 15-year-old Jan Moore, what would that 15-year-old need to hear?
Go to work for Microsoft.
There you go. Did you have that opportunity?
Yeah. I'd say yes, go to work for Microsoft, at least the time that I was 15.
Yep, absolutely.
Go to work for Microsoft. I would tell somebody 20 years younger than me, 15, go to work for Apple. The next one I'd say, go to work for Google. It just depends on how you are, but it would have been one of those three. So I'd say I still have a stock certificate that I bought, one share of stock from Microsoft, like in 1988. That's all I bought.
Yeah, just one share.
Like 80, what is worth today? And all I bought was one share. One
share, yeah, that's incredible.
Crazy, babe, but it's a few $1,000s, and I think I paid 60.
Yeah, and you're wondering why you didn't buy 100 shares, right?
Yeah, exactly.
As we record this podcast, actually, Microsoft just recently announced a $1 billion with a B investment on that same campus where I was having that conversation with that technical college president about 6 years ago, which shows the value of economic development and kind of brings us full circle here, which is, if you are attracting great employers and you're building up that next generation of the workforce, more will come. It really goes back to the old adage, if you build it, they will come, and they will come. If we build a workforce for the future around the technologies we're talking about today, around automation, around smart technology, smart sensors, smart devices, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, if we build that workforce, the employers will find their way to that region. That is exactly what is happening at Ogeechee Tech. And I really, really appreciate your time this morning, Jan, and the opportunity to get to know you, all the great things you're doing. Best of luck, and thank you so much for joining us on the Tech Ed Podcast.
Thank you, Matt. It's been absolutely my pleasure.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Tech Ed Podcast. If you haven't already, subscribe, leave a review, and if you like this episode, share it with a friend. New episodes launch every Tuesday, so listen in next week.